So my job today is to make sure I make you feel just a little bit uncomfortable. That I get a chance to interrogate your thoughts and your beliefs, and that I have you walking out of here questioning who you are. That said, before I jump into this, I want to start with one question. A question that I want you to keep in the back of your mind throughout this entire conversation. And that question is, who are you? Before we jump into this conversation, I want us to take a second to read some of the bullet points that are up here, which essentially are life experiences of someone I know really, really well. I'm going to read a few of these bullet points, and I want you to just process them. Number 1, this person spent 18 years in foster care. This person grew up in one of the worst neighborhoods in the South Bronx. This person was suspended 5 times in high school. This person experienced police brutality at the age of 16. This person ended up getting funneled into the criminal justice system and sent to Rikers Island at the age of 16. And this person lost some friends along the way. Let that sink in. I'm going to ask you a question. Those of us who think that this person graduated high school, please raise your hand. Those of us who think that this person graduated from college, please raise your hand. That person was me. I saw 3, maybe 4 people raise their hands, despite the people that know me. Right? And I'm going to ask this. Those of you who didn't raise your hand, and you don't need to answer this question, but more for you to think about. Why did you think that this person did not graduate high school, nor college? Now, the reality is, only about 3% of you who are in foster care graduate from college nationwide. Not in New York City, not in New York State, nationwide. So maybe there's some truth to your thinking process about why that person you think may have not graduated high school nor college. But as I stand before you, I am a testament that no matter what you've experienced, you can still graduate high school and college. Start to disprove maybe some of your thought process. That said, I want to take a second to tell you who some of these people are in my life, kind of set the stage for the conversation we're going to continue to have. These are pictures of folks who played a significant role in my life and had an impact. You'll see pictures up here of me and my family who are all here today. My mom, my sister, friends. There are advisors up here. And then there are also pictures of me graduating both from Marist College, where I studied social work in undergrad, and Fordham University, where I studied social work in graduate school. And the reason that I studied social work is because I had a lot of questions. I had questions about who I was. I had questions about why I was experiencing so many different inequities that were out of my control, right? Going through foster care and other things. I didn't understand why there was such a high asthma rate in the Bronx, or why we didn't have healthy foods, or Whole Foods, or Trader Joe's. We got Aldi's now, so pretty close, but still not Trader Joe's, right? And I also wanted to know why my peers weren't graduating, why my high school, if you see in this next picture here, at the bottom, looks like a jail, why I'm going through metal detectors, why I'm greeted by officers every day. I had all these questions that no one had ever given me answers to. But I studied social work to find out the answers to those questions that I had. I wanted to know who I was and where I come from. So I started by telling you all that only 3% of youth in foster care graduate from college nationwide. I asked you all to think about why you may think that is the case, or why you thought the person that I started to describe earlier may have not made it. Well, anyone who took some time to actually watch another TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story may start to answer some of those questions. Right? I mentioned that there might be some truth to your thought process, but it is not the whole story. And what I want to do today is lay the foundation for why so many of us in this room thought that this person didn't make it. I introduce to you the cycle of socialization, which is not my own work, but it was created in the 1970s by a woman named Bobby Harrell. And the cycle of socialization tells us that we are all born into categories of social identities that already predispose us to certain dynamics. What do I mean by that? I'm Latino, I'm male, grew up in the South Bronx. There are stories about who I am already, before I'm even born. I did share some characteristics. There's a narrative written about who I am and what my future is supposed to be like. I didn't create that. I didn't want that to be who I was, right? But if I'm looking at all the stories about what it means to be in foster care, end up homeless, end up in jail, unfortunately sometimes not, ended up in worse circumstances, not graduating, etc., right? Those narratives were created about who I was, and I started to believe that at some point in my life. As many of us have probably experienced in some way, shape, or form. So why does that happen? Well, the cycle of socialization is a way for us to start to think about where our thought process comes from in a lot of cases. Right? It tells us that dominant society creates narratives about who we are before we're born, as we're mentioned. Think about a baby. Baby is born, clean slate. They don't have thoughts. They don't have ideas. Right? Who are the first people they see? Their parents, their relatives, school, teachers, and they start to essentially instill in them cultural values, norms, and practices at a very young age. And as time goes on, they start to connect with institutions that continue to further those narratives. The media is hell of a drug, right? If you don't do any of your own homework, you'll believe in anything that they tell you, essentially, right? Institutions like schools, right? We go K through 12, reading textbooks and taking tests and doing all these things, learning about ourselves, kind of, right? Or parts of it in history. But we know that that's not the whole story. If you ever take a second to talk to an OG or somebody who's a little seasoned, some of my OGs told me not to use the word elderly, but seasoned, right? Think about those times when you sat down with them and wanted to learn a little bit more about a historic time period that they may have been alive for. You quickly start to learn that the stories they tell you are not in the textbooks that you're reading about in school. Why is that? And so if you go through K-12 education with this experience, and then everything you're watching on TV from news to shows, etc., is starting to further those same narratives that you probably heard as a child, what do you think that does to you? Now all of a sudden you get older, you start talking to grandma and the OGs in your life and grandpa, and you're like, why didn't I learn about this? And you go through an exploration and almost hit a reset button. Starting to question yourself, and I come back to the question, who are you? Almost feels like a never-ending journey for those of us who start to realize that. Then you get to a place in life where you have a decision to make. Those of you who never really thought about this, today you might say, hey, maybe there is more to who I am. But where do I start? Or you can stay there and continue to perpetuate the same narratives that you were taught about different people, about different cultures, and about different identities. That's what the cycle of socialization tells us. This was written and created in the 70s. We're still talking about this today, 2024. Right? So what happens? As a result of this, as a result of the socialization that takes place, we start to internalize that and then start to cause harm to one another, especially as black and brown people. So there's a really dope book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed that was also written in the 70s. By Paula Perry, and he talks a lot about how when you internalize these messages that we struggle to strive for liberation because the stuff is so deep that you're learning, and if I mention that as a baby, you're hearing the same messages that you're hearing when you're 20-something years old and older, how can we ever break free if you don't stop to think about the question, who am I? And Paula Perry reminds us that internalized oppression is deep. It's so deep that when you adopt the values of dominant culture, oftentimes in America is what we call whiteness, it is created so that we can maintain a level of oppression and marginalization. Dominant culture no longer has to do the work. You'll do it for them. especially as black and brown folks. So how do we counter that? Well, we start to reclaim our own narratives. As black and brown folks, we start to recreate our own identities. We start to interrogate ourselves and start to unpack many of the things that we believe. I started by saying I study social work because I had so many questions. No one ever told me what was going on in my experience, but I wanted to go find out, so I went to do the homework. I wanted to know where my ancestors came from. I'm Puerto Rican and Salvadorian, and in El Salvador, and let me pause for a quick second. Many of us know when we talk about slavery, it took place across Latin America as well, probably more so than here in the U.S., right? But no one ever told me much about El Salvador. And in the 1700s, when our indigenous folks across Latin America were enslaved, not only was their land stolen, but they later on became free once our African brothers and sisters became enslaved and brought to that country. No one ever told me that I come from indigenous folks, that I might have some ancestry that goes all the way back to Africa. No one has had that conversation with me. But when I learned about that and I figured it out, it lit a fire under me. I wanted to make a difference in my community. I got a chance to go back and look at people that look just like me from my very same community and tell them to start to think about who they are, and tell them to start thinking about how we can come together as a community to make change. Because I have information and resources now. So if you think about the OGs and the seasoned folks in your life that gave you the information, they were giving you the resources. They were helping you to navigate society in a way that we've never been taught. There's power in that. What does that look like in terms of community? What is an example of this? How many of us are familiar with the term the Bronx is burning? Few of us. Should go back and look this up. So in 1977, during the World Series, the Dodgers and the Yankees were playing. I'm a Yankee fan, so I'm sad to say this, but the Yankees were getting spanked. It was 6-1, right? Right before the World Series started, there was a building that went up in flames. And the legend is that there was a commentator during the World Series who mentioned, the Bronx is burning. And what did that mean? Very similar stereotypes that we hear today about the Bronx, right? The Bronx is burning, the Bronx is dirty, the Bronx is unsafe. No one wants to go to the Bronx. Don't talk to Brooklyn people about the Bronx, forget about it, right? So much so that people, even in this very community that we're in, Riverdale, don't even want to associate with the Bronx. How many people have heard people from Riverdale say, nah, I don't live in the Bronx? Right? But it's the power of narratives, the things that are created that impact us. And through it all, we get a little clap going. Just take a look at the pictures as you listen to the music.
So they hit hip-hop, you don't stop the rocket to the bang, man. They say, jump the boogie to the rhythm of the boogie beat. Now what you hear is not a test, I'm rapping to the beat. And me, the groove, and my friends are gonna try to make you beat.
Stop the music. While the Bronx was burning, a global phenomenon was born known as hip-hop. A group of people came together and built community. They danced, they DJ, they MC, they shared knowledge. And the world has now adopted that. The power of narratives. Something to think about. To this very day, we still hear the same narratives, negative narratives about the Bronx. But in it, there's so much beauty. So much community. Right? I told you all that I wanted you to think about who you are. And what I'm offering here is that before we can make any real change, especially among black and brown folks, we need to do the work to understand who we are. And for those of us who are part of dominant identities and dominant culture, we also got to do the work to unpack and recreate new narratives. And then I offer that then and only then can we start thinking about change. Because if I don't do the work to understand who I am and where I come from, I might think and have the intent of doing good work, but that can actually cause further harm. Because a lot of those solutions are based in Eurocentric ideology. We need to reconnect with who we are and where we come from in order to be intentional and build community the right way. These are pictures of my good friend Kevin, who's also here, and people who we've been able to connect with. Kevin and I started something called the Bronx Summit, which is an annual event that you heard about in my bio, where we bring together creatives of color in the Bronx who are able to come together and share resources about how they got into the creative economy, whether that be fashion, tech, healthcare, art, etc. Because as I mentioned to you, once I understood who I was and where I came from, I had an obligation to come back to my community and provide those resources and insight. And I had to do what I could to make sure that we can continue to spread this knowledge in our community, because the Bronx is a forgotten borough, but it doesn't have to be anymore. So I leave us with this. These are pictures of some indigenous folks, of hip hop, some of our African brothers and sisters. I challenge you all to think about interrogating yourself, to really thinking about where your ideas and beliefs and thoughts came from, to think about where you come from. This may take years to figure out, but we can start the journey today. And so I want to leave you with this quote. Your culture is your medicine. And when they tell you to leave your culture at the door, you get sick. That's because you left your medicine at the door. This is sometimes what America does to us as folks of color. Thank you.